3 weeks later, David stood in the early morning light watching the deer family in their temporary recovery enclosure. The structure he and his neighbors had built was a testament to community cooperation, a large naturalistic pen that blended seamlessly with the forest environment while providing the security and access needed for the mother deer's medical care. The transformation in the doe's condition had been remarkable. What had once been a terrified, injured animal trapped in rusty wire was now a healthy, alert mother who had regained her strength and dignity. Her wounds had healed cleanly, leaving only faint scars as reminders of her ordeal. More importantly, she had never lost her wild instincts despite the weeks of human care. The fawns had grown noticeably during their time in the enclosure. They were more confident now, their legs longer and stronger, their spotted coats beginning to show the first signs of their adult coloring. They had learned to associate the approaching footsteps of their human caretakers with food and fresh water, but they maintained a respectful distance that showed they remained truly wild animals. Sarah approached the enclosure carrying the morning medical kit, though her visits had become more routine than urgent in recent days. "Dr. Walsh says this will probably be our last wound check," she told David quietly. "The healing is complete and there's no sign of infection or complications." The neighborhood's dedication to the deer family's recovery had been extraordinary. Every day for 3 weeks, volunteers had taken turns providing care, monitoring the animal's health and maintaining the enclosure. Children had drawn pictures of the deer family and posted them on the temporary shelter. Adults had researched deer nutrition and behavior to ensure they were providing the best possible care. Mrs. Patterson had coordinated meal schedules for the volunteers with military precision. Robert Chen had designed an ingenious feeding system that allowed them to provide food and water without entering the enclosure and stressing the deer. The Morrison family had documented the entire recovery process with photographs, creating a record of the neighborhood's remarkable rescue effort. But perhaps most importantly, the community had learned to work together in ways they never had before. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before the rescue had become friends. Children had learned about wildlife conservation and the importance of helping animals in distress. Adults had discovered that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they worked together. Dr. Walsh arrived for what everyone hoped would be the final medical evaluation. She had visited twice weekly throughout the recovery period, and she had been consistently impressed by the quality of care the volunteers had provided. "I've worked with professional wildlife rehabilitation facilities that didn't do as good a job as you folks have done," she said as she examined the doe's healed wounds. "This deer has received better care than she would have gotten at most facilities, and she's maintained her wild behavior patterns perfectly. The critical question now was when and how to release the deer family back into their natural lives. The temporary enclosure had served its purpose, but keeping wild animals confined longer than necessary would be harmful to their well-being and natural instincts. "She's ready to be released," Dr. Walsh announced after completing her examination. "Her wounds are completely healed, she's at full strength, and the fawns are healthy and developing normally. There's no medical reason to keep them confined any longer." David felt a mixture of pride and sadness at this news. He was proud that their rescue effort had been successful, but he had grown attached to the deer family over the weeks of caring for them. Saying goodbye would be harder than he had expected. The release was planned for the following morning, just after dawn, when the deer would be most active and alert. The plan was simple: open the enclosure gate and allow the family to leave on their own terms, returning to the wild preserve that was their natural home. That evening, the entire neighborhood gathered for what had become an impromptu celebration of their successful rescue mission. Someone had brought a cake decorated with deer silhouettes. Children shared stories about what they had learned from watching the deer family recover. Adults talked about how the experience had brought the community together in unexpected ways. Emma, David's daughter, had written a poem about the rescue that she read to the gathering. "The mommy deer was scared and hurt, trapped in the wire and dirt," she recited. "But neighbors came from far and near to help and show they care. Now she's safe and strong and free with babies by her side. The forest is her home, you see, where deer families hide." As the community celebration continued into the evening, David found himself reflecting on how much had changed since that morning 3 weeks ago when he had first heard the deer's desperate calls for help. What had started as an individual act of compassion had grown into something much larger, a demonstration of human kindness and community cooperation that had touched everyone involved. The next morning dawned clear and bright. The neighborhood volunteers gathered quietly around the enclosure, their voices hushed with anticipation and emotion. Dr. Walsh was present to monitor the release and ensure that the deer family transitioned safely back to their wild state. David had the honor of opening the enclosure gate. As he slowly swung it open, the doe immediately noticed the change. She approached the opening cautiously, testing the air with her sensitive nose, her ears alert for any signs of danger. For several minutes, the mother deer stood at the threshold of the open gate, her fawns close beside her. She seemed to be taking time to remember what freedom meant after weeks of confinement, even comfortable and caring confinement. Then, with a graceful bound that reminded everyone of her wild nature, the doe leaped through the opening and into the forest beyond. Her fawns followed immediately, their movements fluid and confident. The family paused once at the edge of the clearing to look back at the humans who had cared for them, as if offering a final acknowledgement of gratitude. And then they were gone, disappearing into the dappled shadows of the forest like the wild creatures they had always been meant to be. The temporary enclosure stood empty, its purpose fulfilled, ready to be dismantled and the natural area restored. As the neighbors began the work of removing the temporary structures and returning the forest to its original state, David realized that while the deer family had returned to their wild lives, the impact of the rescue would remain with the human community forever. The neighborhood had learned that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they worked together with compassion and determination. They had discovered that helping others, even wild animals in distress, brought out the best in everyone involved. Most importantly, they had created bonds of friendship and cooperation that would last long after the last traces of the temporary enclosure had been removed. David smiled as he began dismantling the fence posts, knowing that somewhere in the forest preserve, a mother deer was teaching her fawns how to live free and wild, healthy and whole, thanks to a community that had refused to turn away when help was needed. The rescue was complete, but the memory of what they had accomplished together would inspire acts of kindness and cooperation for years to come. Sarah knelt carefully beside the injured doe, her veterinary training helping her stay calm despite the unusual circumstances of treating a wild deer in the middle of a nature preserve. The mother deer's breathing was shallow but steady, and, while she remained alert, she seemed to understand that these humans meant no harm. "Her pulse is weak but regular," Sarah reported quietly to David and Lisa. "The cuts on her legs are deeper than I thought, and this one on her neck missed the major arteries by inches. She's been incredibly lucky, but she's lost quite a bit of blood." Lisa opened the medical kit they had prepared and began laying out supplies on a clean towel. "What do we do first?" she asked, her nursing experience with humans not quite translating to wildlife medicine. "We need to clean the wounds and stop any active bleeding," Sarah explained, gently examining the deer's injuries. "The good news is that none of the cuts appear to have damaged tendons or joints seriously. The bad news is that several of them are showing early signs of infection from the rusty wire." The fawns watched anxiously as the humans worked on their mother. One of the young deer was particularly bold, approaching close enough to nuzzle Sarah's arm as she worked. The gesture was both touching and encouraging. It suggested that the deer family was beginning to trust their rescuers. David kept watch for the arrival of Dr. Walsh, while also monitoring the other neighbors who remained on the residential side of the fence. The crowd had grown to include nearly 20 people from the neighborhood, all of whom were invested in the outcome of the rescue. "How long until the vet gets here?" Sarah asked, applying antiseptic to a particularly nasty cut on the doe's front leg. The deer flinched but didn't try to pull away, as if she understood that the temporary pain was helping her. "Jim said 20 minutes, and that was 15 minutes ago," David replied, checking his watch. "She should be here any moment." As if summoned by his words, the sound of a vehicle could be heard approaching through the preserve. Dr. Rebecca Walsh arrived in a specially equipped truck designed for wildlife emergencies, complete with medical supplies, transport cages, and sedation equipment. Dr. Walsh was a woman in her 40s with short gray hair, and the calm demeanor of someone who had dealt with wildlife emergencies for decades. She quickly assessed the situation and was impressed by the community effort she witnessed. "I have to say I've never seen such an organized neighborhood rescue operation," she said as she unpacked her medical equipment. "You folks have done an excellent job stabilizing this deer and keeping her calm." The veterinarian's first priority was to properly assess the extent of the doe's injuries. Using a mild sedative, she was able to calm the deer enough to conduct a thorough examination. The diagnosis was cautiously optimistic. "She's got several lacerations that will need stitching, and there's some muscle damage in her left front leg," Dr. Walsh explained as she worked. "But nothing appears to be life-threatening if we can prevent infection and give her time to heal." The bigger question was what to do with the deer family once the mother was treated. Wild deer couldn't simply be taken to a veterinary clinic like domestic animals. They needed to remain in their natural habitat, but they also needed ongoing medical care. "Ideally, we'd set up a temporary recovery area right here in the preserve," Dr. Walsh said. "Somewhere she can rest and heal while staying with her fawns, but that would require building some kind of enclosure and providing daily medical visits." David found himself volunteering before he had fully thought through the implications. "We can do that," he said. "This whole neighborhood has been invested in this rescue from the beginning. I think people would be willing to help with whatever needs to be done." Dr. Walsh looked surprised but pleased. "That's a generous offer, but it would be a significant commitment. We're talking about daily wound care, monitoring for infection, providing food and water, and maintaining a secure but comfortable area for at least 2 to 3 weeks." Sarah immediately supported her husband's offer. "The veterinary clinic where I work has dealt with wildlife rehabilitation before," she said. "I can coordinate with you on the medical care, and I know our neighborhood well enough to organize volunteer schedules." The other neighbors who could hear the conversation from across the fence began calling out their willingness to help. Mrs. Patterson offered to coordinate meal schedules for the volunteers. Robert Chen volunteered his engineering skills to design and build a proper recovery enclosure. The Morrison family offered to handle supply runs for medical equipment and deer-appropriate food. Dr. Walsh spent the next hour stitching and bandaging the doe's wounds while the neighborhood volunteers began planning their extended rescue operation. The mother deer remained surprisingly calm throughout the medical procedure, as if she understood that she was receiving help. The fawns never left their mother's side during the treatment. They seemed to take comfort in the presence of the humans, who had helped reunite their family, and they showed none of the skittishness typically associated with wild deer around people. As Dr. Walsh finished her medical work, she explained what would be needed for the deer's recovery. "She'll need antibiotics twice daily, wound cleaning and fresh bandages every other day, and careful monitoring for any signs of infection or complications," she said. "The enclosure will need to be large enough for her to move around comfortably, but secure enough to prevent her from wandering off before she's fully healed. It also needs to be designed so that volunteers can provide care without causing stress to the animals." David was already envisioning the project in his mind, his construction background helping him plan the logistics. "We can build it right here using this clearing where she's already comfortable," he said. "We'll make it temporary so that when she's healed, we can remove it and restore the natural area." The sun was beginning to set as Dr. Walsh completed her work. The doe was resting comfortably, her wounds properly cleaned and bandaged. Her fawns had settled beside her, finally able to relax now that their mother was safe and receiving care. Looking around at all the neighbors who had spent their entire day working to save a wild deer family, David felt a profound sense of community, pride. What had started as one man's impulse to help a trapped animal had grown into something much larger, a demonstration of what people could accomplish when they worked together for a common cause. But the rescue was still not over. The real work of nursing the deer back to health was just beginning, and it would require weeks of dedication from the entire neighborhood. As David looked at the injured mother deer and her faithful fawns, he knew that every effort would be worth it to see this family return to their natural lives, whole and healthy. The neighborhood had come together to save these deer, and now they were committed to seeing the rescue through to its successful conclusion. David approached the gap in the fence with extreme caution. carrying wire cutters to remove the remaining sharp mesh that could injure the deer as she passed through. The doe watched him intently, her muscles tense and ready to flee, but her maternal instincts kept her focused on the opening that would lead to her fawns. "Talk to her softly," Sarah advised from a safe distance. "Let her know you're trying to help." "Easy, Mama," David said in a gentle voice as he carefully cut away the dangerous wire fragments. "We're going to get you back to your babies." He worked quickly but deliberately, removing each sharp obstacle while keeping his movement slow and non-threatening. The fawns on the other side of the fence had discovered they could actually fit through the gap already. One of the young deer began to squeeze through the opening, its spotted coat barely fitting through the space. But the mother deer immediately became more agitated, making sharp warning sounds that caused the fawn to back away. "She doesn't want her babies coming over here," Robert observed. "She knows this side isn't safe because this is where she got trapped." Lisa had been monitoring the doe's condition and was growing increasingly worried. "She's showing more signs of fatigue and blood loss," she reported. "We're running out of time. She needs to get through that gap soon, or we need to treat her wounds right now." David finished clearing the last of the sharp wire from the opening. The gap was now clean and wide enough for the deer to pass through safely, but getting her to actually use it was another challenge entirely. The doe approached the opening several times, even putting her head through to nuzzle her fawns, but she seemed afraid to commit to crawling through. Emma had an idea that showed wisdom beyond her 10 years. "What if we move away from the gap?" she suggested. "Maybe she's scared to go through while we're watching her." David considered this carefully. Moving away from the gap meant losing some control over the situation, but it also meant reducing the stress on the deer. If the mother felt safe enough to attempt passage, she might be able to reunite with her fawns on her own. "Let's try it," David decided. "But we stay close enough to help if something goes wrong." The group of neighbors slowly backed away from the fence, giving the deer family more space. They positioned themselves where they could still observe what was happening, but far enough away that their presence wouldn't be intimidating. The strategy worked better than anyone had hoped. With the humans at a distance, the doe approached the gap with much more confidence. She sniffed the opening carefully, checking for any remaining dangers. Her fawns called to her encouragingly from the other side, and she responded with soft maternal sounds. Then, in a moment that brought tears to several of the watching neighbors' eyes, the mother deer carefully lowered herself to the ground and began crawling through the gap. Her injured legs made the process difficult, and she had to rest halfway through, but her determination to reach her babies kept her moving. The fawns were beside themselves with excitement as they watched their mother emerge on their side of the fence. The moment she was fully through, they rushed to her side, nuzzling against her and making happy chirping sounds. The mother deer immediately began cleaning and inspecting her babies, her maternal relief evident in every movement. "We did it," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "They're back together." But the celebration was premature. As David watched the reunited family, he realized that the mother deer's injuries were more serious than they had initially appeared. She was having difficulty standing after crawling through the gap, and there was fresh blood on the ground where she had been lying. "She needs medical attention," Lisa said urgently. "Those wounds are infected, and she may have internal injuries from struggling in the wire trap." The group faced a new dilemma. They had successfully reunited the deer family, but the mother was now on the preserve side of the fence where they couldn't easily reach her to provide medical care. The wildlife rescue team was still at least an hour away, and the deer might not survive that long without treatment. Mr. Yamamoto suggested widening the gap even more, so that humans could also pass through to reach the injured deer. "If we can get to her, maybe we can at least stop the bleeding until the professionals arrive," he said. David was torn between wanting to help further and recognizing that they had already pushed the boundaries of what untrained civilians should attempt with wild animals. "We've done what we set out to do," he said. "Maybe we should wait for the experts now." But as they watched, the mother deer tried to stand and immediately collapsed again. Her fawns nuzzled her anxiously, sensing that something was wrong. The Sight was heartbreaking, and several of the neighbors began to cry. Mrs. Patterson's husband, Jim, arrived at that moment with surprising news. He had not only contacted the Parks Department, but had also reached a local wildlife veterinarian who was willing to make an emergency call. Dr. Rebecca Walsh was already on her way with medical supplies and tranquilizer equipment. "She'll be here in 20 minutes, Jim reported, "and I brought bolt cutters to remove the chain from the maintenance gate if we need better access." This news energized the entire group. Help was coming, and they just needed to keep the deer stable until professional medical care arrived. Sarah, with her veterinary training, felt confident that she could at least assess the deer's condition and provide basic first aid if they could reach her safely. The decision was made to widen the gap enough for humans to pass through. David and Mr. Yamamoto worked together to bend back more fence posts, while Robert used his engineering knowledge to ensure they weren't compromising the structural integrity of the barrier. As they worked, more neighbors continued to arrive. Word had spread through the community about the rescue effort, and people came bearing supplies: blankets, first aid materials, bottled water, and even a portable camping stretcher that someone thought might be useful for transporting an injured deer. Lisa prepared a medical kit specifically for treating the deer's wounds, combining her own first aid supplies with materials that Sarah had brought from the veterinary clinic. They laid out antiseptic solutions, bandages, and pain medication that Dr. Walsh had authorized Sarah to administer over the phone. The gap was now wide enough for people to pass through safely. David was the first to crawl through, followed by Sarah and Lisa. The three of them approached the deer family slowly and calmly, speaking in soft, reassuring voices. The mother deer watched them approach with alert but tired eyes. She seemed to remember these humans from her earlier rescue and didn't attempt to flee. Her fawns stayed close to her side, protective but not aggressive toward the people who had helped bring their family back together. As Sarah knelt beside the injured deer to assess her condition, David realized that what had started as a simple attempt to help a trapped animal had grown into something much larger, a community-wide effort that had tested everyone's courage, creativity, and compassion. The rescue was about to enter its most critical phase, with professional help, finally, on the way, and the deer family depending on their continued care and dedication. The freed doe stood for a moment, her sides heaving as she caught her breath and assessed her surroundings. Blood trickled from several cuts on her legs and neck, but her eyes were focused entirely on the fence that still separated her from her crying fawns. She approached the barrier and began searching frantically for a way through, running back and forth along the length of the fence line. David and the other rescuers watched with growing concern as they realized their work was far from over. The immediate danger of the wire trap had been eliminated, but the mother deer was becoming increasingly agitated as she tried unsuccessfully to reach her babies. The fawns, sensing their mother was nearby, pressed themselves against the fence from their side, their calls becoming more desperate. "We need to find a way to get her to the other side," Sarah said, studying the fence structure. "Or find a way to get the fawns over here." The fence was about 6 feet high and appeared to be in better condition than the section that had trapped the deer. It was designed to keep people out of the nature preserve, but it was also effectively keeping wildlife families separated when they tried to move between the preserve and the suburban buffer zone. Robert Chen walked along the fence, line his engineer's eye searching for weak points or gaps. "There's got to be a maintenance gate somewhere," he said. "These perimeter fences always have access points for Park Service workers." While Robert searched for an official opening, David examined the fence itself. His construction experience told him that creating an opening would be possible, but it would require more tools and more time. Meanwhile, the doe was becoming exhausted from running back and forth, and her wounds were still bleeding. "She needs medical attention," Lisa observed, watching the deer's increasingly labored movements. "Those cuts are deeper than I initially thought, and she's losing blood. Plus, all this running around is making her injuries worse." Mrs. Patterson had an idea. "My husband used to work for the Parks Department before he retired," she said. "I'll call him and see if he knows where the maintenance gates are located, or if he has any contacts who could help us." While Mrs. Patterson made her phone call, Mr. Yamamoto had discovered something interesting. About 100 yards down the fence line, There was a section where a large tree had fallen during a recent storm. The tree had bent the fence posts and created a gap near the ground that was almost large enough for a deer to squeeze through. If we could widen this gap just a little bit, it might work, Mr. Yamamoto suggested, showing David the damaged section. The posts are already loosened by the tree damage. We just need to pull them back a bit more. David examined the area and agreed it was their best option. The gap was low to the ground, which would be safer for the deer than trying to climb over the fence. It was also away from the immediate area where the doe had been trapped, so she might be more willing to approach it. The challenge was getting the mother deer to move away from the section of fence where her fawns were waiting and guide her to the potential escape route. Wild animals don't understand human intentions, and trying to herd a stressed deer could result in injury to both the animal and the people involved. Sarah had an idea based on her veterinary training. "We need to move the fawns first," she said. "If we can gently encourage the babies to move along their side of the fence toward the gap, their mother will follow from this side." Emma, David's daughter, volunteered for this delicate task. "I'm small and I move quietly," she said. "Animals aren't as scared of kids as they are of adults." David was hesitant to involve his daughter in something potentially dangerous, but Sarah supported Emma's offer. "She's right, and she's been around animals at my clinic enough to understand how to move calmly around them." Under Sarah's careful supervision, Emma slowly approached the fence from the fawn's side. She moved in a wide arc, staying low and making soft, encouraging sounds. The young deer watched her with curiosity rather than fear, and gradually began to move in the direction Emma was leading them. Meanwhile, David and Mr. Yamamoto worked to widen the gap in the fence. Using crowbars and rope, they carefully pulled the bent fence posts further apart, creating an opening that would accommodate an adult deer. The work had to be done quietly to avoid frightening the deer family. As Emma successfully guided the fawns toward the gap, their mother followed along the other side of the fence. The doe seemed to understand that the human child was somehow helping, and her frantic running gave way to a more purposeful walk. Robert had found something even better during his search. There was indeed a maintenance gate about a quarter-mile down the fence line, but it was secured with a heavy chain and lock. However, Mrs. Patterson's call to her husband had yielded valuable information. He still had contacts in the Parks Department and had managed to reach someone who could bring a key to the gate. "The parks worker is on his way," Mrs. Patterson reported, "but it's going to take him at least 40 minutes to get here. The question is whether our deer family can wait that long." Lisa was growing more concerned about the mother deer's condition. The animal was clearly weakening from blood loss and stress. "I don't think she can wait 40 minutes, Lisa said. "We need to get her through this gap we're creating, or we need to find a way to treat her wounds right now." David made the decision to continue with their improvised escape route. "We'll get her through this gap," he said firmly. "It's her best chance, and those fawns need their mother." The gap was now wide enough, but there was another problem. The opening was partially blocked by broken fence mesh that had sharp edges. David realized they would need to clear these obstacles and possibly guide the deer through the opening, which meant getting close to a wild animal that was already stressed and potentially unpredictable. As if sensing their urgency, the doe approached the gap and began investigating it. She could smell her fawns on the other side and could see them through the opening, but she was cautious about the unfamiliar passage, especially with humans nearby. The fawns, meanwhile, had discovered the gap from their side and were calling to their mother with renewed excitement. They could see her clearly now, and the reunion they all desperately wanted seemed within reach. David knew this was the critical moment. Everything they had done so far had led to this point. A wild deer family separated by human barriers, with a community of neighbors risking their safety to bring them back together. The next few minutes would determine whether their rescue mission would succeed or end in tragedy. Taking a deep breath, David prepared to take the biggest risk yet in this extraordinary rescue attempt. David approached the trapped deer slowly, his heart pounding as he studied the complex tangle of wire that held her captive. The old chain-link fence had been damaged by storms and fallen trees over the years, creating a deadly maze of twisted metal. The doe had apparently tried to jump through what looked like an opening, only to find herself caught in multiple loops of wire around her neck, front legs, and torso. "Stay calm, girl," David whispered softly, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the deer or himself. Behind him, Sarah was quietly explaining to the other neighbors how they needed to work together to make this rescue successful. "The most important thing is that we don't panic her further," Sarah said in a low voice. "David, you'll need to cut the wire systematically, starting with the pieces that are causing the most restriction. But we need someone to help support her weight so she doesn't thrash around when she feels the wires loosening." Robert Chen stepped forward with a thick moving blanket he had retrieved from his garage. "I can help stabilize her," he said. "In my engineering days, I dealt with trapped machinery that could be just as dangerous if it moved suddenly." Lisa, the nurse, positioned herself where she could monitor the deer's condition and watch for signs of shock or injury. Mrs. Patterson had brought more towels and stood ready to help with any bleeding wounds they might discover. The Fawns on the other side of the fence had not stopped their desperate calling. Their mother responded with soft grunts and bleats, trying to reassure them even in her own distress. David could see that her maternal instincts were making her even more frantic. She needed to get to her babies. David began with the wire around the deer's neck, which posed the greatest immediate danger. The rusty chain link had twisted into a collar-like trap that was getting tighter each time she moved. Using his wire cutters, he carefully worked to snip the metal while Robert gently held the blanket against the deer's side to prevent sudden movements. The first cut released some pressure, and the doe immediately tried to lunge forward. "Easy, easy," David said, his voice steady and calm. He had learned from years of construction work that staying composed in dangerous situations was crucial. Any sign of panic from him would make the animal even more frightened. As David continued cutting, Sarah noticed that the deer had several deep cuts on her legs where the wire had dug in. "We're going to need to treat those wounds as soon as we free her," she told Lisa. "Do you have your first aid training supplies with you?" Lisa nodded and held up a well-stocked emergency kit she had grabbed from her car. "I've got antiseptic, gauze, and medical tape, but I'm not sure how we're going to treat a wild deer." "One problem at a time," David said, snipping another section of wire. He was making progress, but the work was delicate and slow. Each cut had to be precise to avoid injuring the deer further, and he had to constantly adjust his position to reach different angles of the twisted metal. More neighbors had gathered to watch and help. The Morrison children had been sent to bring water bowls, thinking the deer might be thirsty after her ordeal. Mr. Yamamoto from down the street arrived with professional-looking wire cutters from his workshop, offering them as an upgrade to David's basic tools. "These will cut through that thick gauge wire much easier," Mr. Yamamoto said, demonstrating the powerful cutters. David gratefully accepted the better equipment, and the rescue work began moving more quickly. As each wire was cut, the deer seemed to understand that something was changing. Her breathing became less labored, and while she was still alert and ready to bolt, she seemed to sense that the humans were trying to help rather than harm her. The most challenging part came when David reached the wire wrapped around her front legs. The deer's weight was partially supported by these wires, and cutting them meant she might suddenly drop or try to run before all the restraints were removed. This was where Robert's engineering experience became invaluable. "We need to support her weight gradually as you cut each wire," Robert explained. "I'll use the blanket to create a sling under her chest. When you cut the leg wires, she won't drop suddenly." The improvised sling worked perfectly. As David cut through the wire around her legs, Robert was able to take up the slack and support the deer's weight. Sarah monitored the animal's vital signs as best she could from a safe distance, watching for any signs that the stress was becoming too much for her to handle. Lisa had prepared gauze pads and antiseptic for the wounds they could see, but she was also concerned about injuries they couldn't see yet. "Once she's free, we need to check her over quickly before she runs off," Lisa said. "Some of these cuts look pretty deep." The work continued methodically for over an hour. Each neighbor had found a role in the rescue. Some cutting wire, others supporting the deer, and several keeping watch on the increasingly agitated fawns, who could sense their mother's distress but couldn't understand why the humans wouldn't. "Let them get closer, Emma and Jake, David's children, had woken up and come outside to see what all the commotion was about. Sarah had given them the important job of keeping other curious neighbors at a safe distance and making sure no one made loud noises that might startle the deer. "Dad's like a superhero," Jake whispered to his sister as they watched their father work carefully with the wire cutters. "He's saving the mommy deer so she can get back to her babies." Emma nodded seriously. At 10 years old, she understood that what they were witnessing was something special, a moment when ordinary people chose to do something extraordinary for a creature that couldn't help herself. As David cut through the final pieces of wire around the deer's torso, the animal seemed to realize that freedom was within reach. Her muscles tensed, and everyone could sense that she was preparing to bolt the moment she was completely free. "Everyone needs to be ready to step back quickly," David warned. "Once I cut this last wire, she's going to run, and we don't want to be in her path." The wire cutters closed around the final strand of metal, and with a sharp snap, the last restraint fell away. For just a moment, the deer stood perfectly still, as if she couldn't quite believe she was finally free. Then, with a powerful leap that seemed to defy gravity, she bounded toward the fence that separated her from her fawns. But the rescue wasn't over yet. The fence that had trapped her was still there, and David realized that even though she was free from the wire, the deer family still faced the barrier that had caused this problem in the first place. The real challenge was just beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban neighborhood of Millbrook as David Martinez stepped onto his front porch with his usual cup of coffee. At 42, David worked as a construction foreman and was used to early mornings, but this Saturday felt different. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the leaves on the oak trees lining his street had begun their transformation into brilliant shades of gold and crimson. David had moved to this peaceful community 3 years ago with his wife, Sarah, and their 2 children, Emma and Jake. The neighborhood bordered a large nature preserve, which was one of the main reasons they had chosen this location. The family loved watching the wildlife that occasionally wandered into their backyard: rabbits, squirrels, and sometimes even deer. As David sipped his coffee and enjoyed the tranquil morning, a frantic bleating sound broke the silence. At first he thought it might be a neighbor's dog, but the sound was different, more desperate and wild. Setting down his mug, he walked toward the edge of his property where the sound seemed to be coming from. Behind his wooden fence, David could see movement in the small wooded area that separated his neighborhood from the main preserve. The bleating continued, accompanied by what sounded like thrashing and scraping. Curiosity getting the better of him, David grabbed his work boots from the garage and made his way through the gate that led to the wooded buffer zone. The scene that greeted him made his heart sink. A beautiful white-tailed doe was trapped in an old chain-link fence that had been partially torn down years ago but never fully removed. The rusty metal had created a maze of twisted wire and sharp edges, and the deer had somehow gotten herself tangled in it while trying to pass through. But that wasn't the worst part. On the other side of the fence, 2 tiny fawns, probably only a few weeks old, were calling desperately for their mother. Their spotted coats trembled as they pressed against the fence trying to reach her. The doe was struggling violently, making her situation worse with each panicked movement. Blood was beginning to show where the wire had cut into her legs and neck. David knew he had to act quickly. Wild animals could die from shock and stress, especially when separated from their young. He also knew that approaching a trapped deer could be extremely dangerous. Their powerful legs could easily break bones if they kicked in panic. Running back to his house, David called out to his wife, "Sarah, I need your help out here." Within minutes, he had explained the situation. Sarah, a veterinary technician at the local animal clinic, immediately understood the urgency. "We need to call the Wildlife Rescue Center," she said, already reaching for her phone. "But David, they might not be able to get here for hours, and that deer could seriously injure herself or die from stress by then." David nodded grimly. He had seen injured animals before during his construction work, and he knew time was critical. While Sarah made the call, David gathered supplies from his garage: wire cutters, thick work gloves, a large blanket, and a first aid kit. The Wildlife Rescue Center confirmed Sarah's fears. Their emergency response team was dealing with a situation on the other side of the county, and wouldn't be available for at least 3 hours. The dispatcher warned them not to approach the deer, as stressed wild animals could be unpredictable and dangerous. But as David returned to the fence and saw the doe's increasingly desperate struggles and heard the pitiful cries of the fawns, he knew he couldn't wait. The animal was already showing signs of exhaustion and her injuries were getting worse. "I'm going to try to help her," David told his wife. Sarah, despite her professional training telling her to wait for experts, could see the determination in her husband's eyes. She also saw the way the fawns were crying for their mother, and her heart ached for the family that was being torn apart by something as simple as an old fence. "If you're going to do this, we do it right," Sarah said firmly. "I'll guide you through it. We need to approach this carefully and methodically." David's neighbor, Robert Chen, had noticed the commotion and came over to see what was happening. Robert, a retired engineer, immediately offered to help. Soon, Sarah's friend Lisa, who lived 2 houses down and worked as a nurse, had also joined the impromptu rescue team. The 4 neighbors stood at the edge of the wooded area, looking at the trapped deer and her crying babies. The situation was becoming more urgent by the minute. The doe had stopped struggling as much, which Sarah recognized as a bad sign. It could mean she was going into shock. "We need a plan," David said, his construction experience kicking in. "This isn't just about cutting the wire. We need to think about every step: how to calm her down, how to support her weight, how to treat her injuries, and how to reunite her with her fawns safely." As the group huddled together to devise their rescue strategy, more neighbors began to notice the situation. Mrs. Patterson from across the street brought over some old towels. The Morrison family offered their pool netting, thinking it might be useful. Word was spreading through the neighborhood and people were eager to help. David looked at the growing group of volunteers and felt a surge of gratitude for his community. This wasn't just about saving one deer anymore. It had become a neighborhood mission. But he also felt the weight of responsibility. One wrong move could result in serious injury to the deer, her fawns, or even to the people trying to help. The morning sun was climbing higher, and David knew they were running out of time. The doe's breathing had become more labored, and her struggles were weakening. The fawns continued their desperate calls, not understanding why their mother couldn't come to them. Taking a deep breath, David picked up the wire cutters and started walking toward the fence. The real rescue was about to begin, and there was no turning back. Behind him, his neighbors followed, each carrying supplies and hoping that their combined efforts would be enough to save a mother and reunite her with her children. The trapped deer looked up at the approaching humans with wild, fearful eyes, not knowing that help had finally arrived.